Hey guys, tonight we're going to do something a little wild. Forget your thermostat, forget your electric blanket, and for a moment, imagine living in a world where heat was not a button on the wall but a daily battle for survival. I'm talking about Victorian England in the dead of winter, where your morning routine wasn't coffee and emails. It was trying to unstick your socks from the frozen floorboards. Now, I know what you're thinking. How did people survive without heaters, without insulation, without even the luxury of double-pane windows? Was it all just about wearing extra layers, or were there stranger, more desperate tricks hidden in the pages of history? The truth is, surviving a Victorian winter was like playing a game you couldn't win. You just hoped to lose slowly. Picture this. You open your eyes one January morning in 1850. Before you even sit up, you can see your breath rising in little white puffs, as if you've been transported inside a refrigerator. Your bedroom window has grown its own lace of frost, beautiful from a distance but cruel up close. The glass is so thin that the outside world has essentially moved in. It doesn't matter how many layers of wallpaper your parents put up. It's just decoration over an icebox. And your bed. Forget the Instagram image of a cozy Victorian four-poster. What you've actually got is a sagging mattress stuffed with horsehair, lumpy blankets that smell faintly of damp wool, and a sibling pressed so close to your side you can feel their elbow in your ribs. No central heating. No space heater humming in the corner. Just bodies, blankets, and whatever random object could be heated long enough to provide a flicker of comfort. And trust me, Victorian heating hacks ranged from clever to downright insane. But before we get into the tricks, let's linger in that morning moment. You're lying under 5 blankets, debating the single hardest decision of the day. Do you dare get out of bed? Because the second your feet touch the floor, you know it's going to feel like stepping onto an ice rink. Victorian homes didn't have insulation worth mentioning. Floorboards leaked cold air straight from the ground below. And if you think socks were your savior, well, picture wool socks so stiff from last night's condensation that they've frozen to the floor. Congratulations, you're now wrestling your own wardrobe before breakfast. And speaking of breakfast, don't imagine pancakes and hot coffee. Imagine porridge that's been simmering all night on a weak fire. It's gray, it's lukewarm, and it tastes faintly of smoke because everything in a Victorian house tasted of smoke. Tea, though, that was the lifeline. Hot, bitter, occasionally flavored with milk that had to be chipped out of a jug like you were mining for dairy. But in that moment, with steam rising and your hands wrapped around the cup, it was enough to remind you that warmth wasn't completely extinct. The thing is, winter wasn't just cold, it was invasive. Every corner of the house worked against you. Windows weren't barriers, they were invitations for frost to decorate your living room. Drafts slithered through cracks like uninvited ghosts, brushing across your neck just as you were about to fall asleep. Families tried everything, stuffing rags under doors, tacking up old curtains, even pasting newspapers against the walls. At some point, your living room looked less like a cozy parlor and more like a junk shop barricade. And yet somehow, there was always that one draft, your personal nemesis, that found its way to your toes at 3 in the morning. Now let's talk about the family fire. In theory, this was the heart of the home. In practice, it was a smoky, stubborn, half-hearted flame that had to be fed constantly. Coal was expensive, and it never seemed to last as long as you needed it to. Every family had its rituals, building the fire, poking it, praying over it like it was a sacred duty. And if that fire went out in the middle of the night, it was a household tragedy. Everyone woke up to the silence of dead embers and the bone-deep chill creeping back in. Imagine the blame game that followed. Who was supposed to add more coal? Didn't you poke the embers before bed? Entire legends formed around the family member who once let the fire die. Some claim they never truly recovered from the shame. Of course, not every home could even afford enough coal. Poorer families resorted to scavenging, burning scraps of wood, old furniture, even animal dung just to keep something, anything, burning in the grate. The smoke blackened walls, settled in lungs, and clung to every scrap of fabric in the house. You couldn't escape it. Step outside and you'd see entire neighborhoods shrouded in a sooty fog, chimneys coughing like 1,000 sick giants. But the fight against cold wasn't just about fires or blankets. It was about ingenuity. The Victorians invented their own portable heaters. And no, I don't mean the kind you buy at Walmart. I'm talking about hot potatoes tucked into pockets, bricks heated by the fire and wrapped in rags, even metal pans filled with coals slipped under the sheets before bed. These were solutions born from desperation. Sometimes they worked, sometimes they left scorch marks on your mattress, and sometimes they gave you third-degree burns in places you really don't want to think about. But in those first few seconds, when the heat seeped into frozen toes, they must have felt like little miracles. And then there were the beds themselves. Imagine climbing under layers of heavy quilts, only to find that the damp cold still crept in like an unwelcome guest. Families often slept huddled together, not out of sentimentality, but out of sheer necessity. Privacy was a dream for another century. Brothers, sisters, cousins, even pets piled in together, a tangle of limbs and elbows, each person jockeying for the warmest spot. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't romantic. But it was survival. Bathing. Don't even get me started. If you thought showering on a cold winter morning today was hard, imagine dragging buckets of water from a half-frozen well, trying to heat it over a sputtering fire, and then lowering yourself into a tin tub set in the middle of a drafty kitchen. By the time the third sibling got their turn, the water was closer to swamp than bath, which is why, unsurprisingly, most people simply didn't. Hygiene took a backseat to not freezing to death. Winter was the season of unwashed hair, stiff collars, and enough body odor to peel paint off the walls. And illness. Winter practically invited it in. Every cough echoed through the house. Sore throats spread faster than gossip. And the remedies were just as likely to terrify you as cure you. Mustard plasters that burned your skin, goose fat rubbed on your chest, or yes, leeches. Doctors weren't much better. Their advice often boiled down to get some fresh air in a season where stepping outside was a death sentence. So how did people endure it? With humor, with stubbornness, with rituals passed down through generations. They prayed, they sang. They layered clothes until they resembled moving laundry piles. They invented traditions around suffering, telling stories by the fire, playing parlor games to keep spirits up, writing long letters to distant relatives about frost on the windows and coal shortages. It was misery, yes, but it was shared misery. And somehow that made it bearable. Now, I want you to think about this. Tonight, when you turn up your thermostat or climb into a warm bed with clean sheets, imagine trading it all for the crackle of a fire you weren't sure would last the night. Imagine choosing between frostbite or using a potato as a hand warmer. Imagine waking up to frost inside your window and wondering if this would be the year you finally lost a toe to the cold. That was life for the Victorians. Brutal, unforgiving. And yet, in its own strange way, it built resilience, creativity, and an endless supply of bizarre stories. And trust me, we've only just scratched the surface. Because if you thought frozen socks and smoky fireplaces were bad, wait until we dive into chamber pots that turned into ice sculptures, draft wars fought with curtains and carpets, and the social politics of who got the warmest spot in the family cuddle pile. So grab a blanket, pour yourself a hot drink, and settle in. We're about to walk step by icy step through the ridiculous, painful, and strangely inspiring ways Victorians survived the winter without heat. So, let's step deeper into this frozen nightmare. Imagine bedtime, the one moment of the day when you're supposed to find rest, peace, maybe even a little comfort. In the Victorian world, though, bedtime was less about relaxation and more like preparing for battle. The bed itself was a paradox. On paper, a Victorian four-poster looks romantic, carved wood, embroidered quilts, maybe even some lace. In practice, it was a creaking wooden frame with joints that screamed at every movement, a mattress stuffed with straw or horsehair that smelled faintly of regret, and springs that had a bad habit of stabbing you in the ribs at the worst possible moment. If you shared the bed with siblings, and you did, personal space was as mythical as unicorns. You'd roll into the middle into that infamous sagging dip where everyone's bodies pooled together like unwilling sardines. And then came the blankets. Victorians didn't own a blanket. They owned layers. Heavy woolen quilts, old tartans, patched together comforters filled with whatever could be sewn in. Sometimes feathers, sometimes rags, sometimes things best not identified. Every bed looked like a topographical map of hills and valleys, lumps and ridges pressing down on you. Too light and you froze, too heavy and you lay there trapped, pinned under the collective weight of your family's entire textile history. Some joke that if the cold didn't kill you, suffocation by blanket just might. But even beneath all that, drafts still found you. It was like winter had a personal vendetta, sneaking icy fingers across your ankles, creeping up your spine, whispering, "Nice try, but I'm still here." Families fought endless wars against these drafts, stuffing rags in cracks, hanging carpets on walls, even jamming newspapers into window frames. Yet somehow, at 3 in the morning, there was always that single stream of air slithering straight into your bones. Nightwear. Forget silk pajamas. You slept in layers of flannel so thick you could barely move. A nightcap that made you look like an extra in a Dickens play. Socks so coarse they could sand a table. And if you were lucky, someone slipped a heated brick or a hot water bottle into the bed. That first touch of warmth against frozen feet was heaven, until 3 seconds later when it cooled into something resembling a damp stone. And still, people endured. They told stories under the covers. They whispered prayers. They laughed at the absurdity of it all because what else could you do? Sleep became a communal act, less about dreams and more about survival. Now let's talk about mornings. Imagine waking up to a world where even the water jug beside your bed is frozen solid. No quick splash of warm water on the face. Instead, you're banging the jug against the table, chipping out ice with a spoon, watching shards scatter across the room. If you're unlucky, you get sent outside to fetch more water from the well. A miserable pilgrimage through frozen mud, past chickens who eye you like you're the fool for living without feathers. The well cover is frozen shut. Your fingers ache as you haul up the bucket, and by the time you stagger back inside, the water is barely above freezing anyway. Breakfast doesn't save you. Forget bacon and eggs. Forget stacks of pancakes. You get porridge, gray, lukewarm, and sticky, like wallpaper paste that someone accidentally flavored with despair. Maybe tea if the family can afford it. But the milk is frozen, so you chip off a chunk and hope it melts in the cup. Butter is harder than stone. Bread is stale, and if you're lucky enough to get a bit of jam, it's celebrated like a national holiday. And the fire. Oh, the fire. It's both salvation and torment. Getting it lit in the morning was an ordeal. Coal was always damp, newspapers never caught, and the fire smoked more than it flamed. You'd poke, prod, and coax it like a temperamental pet, begging it to stay alive. When it finally caught, the entire family gathered around like moths, fighting for the best spot. But the fire never heated the whole house. The parlor might be barely comfortable, but the bedrooms stayed icy. The hallways felt like tombs, and the privy, don't even ask. When the fire went out, disaster. Silence fell, the room chilled instantly, and everyone glared at the unlucky soul who was supposed to tend it. Then came the frantic scramble for kindling, newspapers, scraps of wood, even old shoes. Families whispered legends of the cousin who once let the fire die and was never forgiven. Some claimed she moved to Brighton. Others swore she froze solid where she stood. Either way, letting the fire die was almost a crime. And if you think going outside was better, think again. Boots were thin, socks never dry, and every street was a skating rink of ice and mud. The wind cut through 6 layers of clothing like it wasn't even there. People stuffed bricks, potatoes, even heated pans into their pockets just to keep from losing their fingers. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it just left burns and embarrassment. But what choice did they have? So here's the picture. Inside, you're huddled under blankets, wrestling with drafts, praying the fire stays alive. Outside, you're waddling through icy streets with hot vegetables in your pockets, hoping your boots don't collapse. Food is bland, water is frozen, illness is everywhere, and yet somehow people survived. Not just survived, but built lives, raised families, wrote letters, fell in love, and kept telling stories by the fire. And that's what amazes me. Not just the suffering, but the creativity, the stubborn humor, the way communities turned even the worst nights into a kind of ritual. Because in the end, survival wasn't just about coal or blankets. It was about people enduring together, one freezing night at a time. Icy mornings, stubborn fires, porridge colder than your patience. But what did Victorians actually do when all that wasn't enough? They got creative. Desperation is the mother of invention, and nothing proves it better than a Victorian winter. Let's start with the most bizarre heating devices you can imagine. Ever heard of a brass warming pan? Picture this. A shiny metal pan with a lid filled with hot coals from the kitchen hearth, slid under your sheets right before bedtime. Sounds clever, right? Except this wasn't a cozy little gadget. It was basically a fire hazard disguised as a comfort item. One night you'd get gently warmed toes. The next, your sheets might start smoldering, your eyebrows singed, and suddenly you've invented indoor arson. Families treated warming pans with the same mix of awe and terror people now reserve for chainsaws. Some swore they gave them the best sleep of their lives. Others ended up with scorched blankets and lifelong stories about the night the bed nearly went up in flames. Then, there was the humble hot water bottle, but not the rubber kind we know. These were stoneware jugs or heavy metal canisters. Imagine cuddling with a cannonball that might leak, explode, or freeze solid by morning. If you didn't get one of those, you made do with a heated brick wrapped in rags, or, believe it or not, a potato. Yes, a potato. Families roasted spuds in the fire, stuffed them into socks or pockets, and carried them around like primitive hand warmers. For a few minutes, bliss. After 10, you were just holding a cold lump that smelled faintly of stew. Still, it worked well enough that people kept doing it. In fact, some even ate the potato after it cooled down, a survival 2-for-1. Pets, too, were part of the strategy. The family cat wasn't just a mouser, it was a portable radiator. Children bribed it with scraps, hoping it would choose their bed for the night. Dogs, bigger and warmer, were basically furry hot water bottles with legs. Imagine waking up wedged between your siblings and a spaniel, all of you tangled in blankets, snoring in chorus. Not glamorous, but it kept you alive. Rabbits and guinea pigs sometimes ended up tucked under coats, turning children into lumpy, twitching cocoons. Even livestock played a role. Poorer families sometimes shared one-room cottages with chickens or goats, not because they loved the smell, but because animal body heat was free insulation. And then, of course, came the huddle. Forget personal space. Forget dignity. When the mercury dropped, the entire family piled together like penguins on an iceberg. The youngest always got shoved to the middle, safe, warm, and slightly squashed, while the eldest claimed the coveted edge near the hot brick or bottle. Everyone else was wedged in wherever they fit, limbs tangled, elbows jabbed, secrets whispered in the dark. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. Some even said the family pile was better than blankets, at least until Uncle George started snoring like a broken accordion. But heat wasn't the only enemy. Drafts were the silent assassins of the Victorian home. You'd think you were safe, buried under quilts, only to feel an icy finger creep across your neck at 2 a.m. Families waged full-on wars against these invisible intruders. Heavy curtains were hung, towels stuffed under doors, newspapers wedged into window frames. Some even glued windows shut until spring, trading fresh air for survival. Grandmothers swore by charms. Sprigs of rosemary or dried lavender hung above doorways to ward off evil drafts. And yet, no matter what, the cold always found a way back in. Meals were just as much about survival as warmth. Root cellars brimmed with turnips, cabbages, and pies hard enough to use as bricks. Bread went stale in days, and every meal became a test of culinary creativity. Stale bread. Fry it, boil it in milk, or hammer it into stuffing. Butter was frozen solid, milk poured out in chunks, and jam was a luxury to be rationed like treasure. Families joked that you never bit into a winter pie without whispering a prayer first. You never knew if it was going to taste like heaven or like mystery meat that should have been left in the yard. And sickness. That was as much a part of winter as frost on the windows. Every house echoed with coughs and wheezes. Every family stocked with goose grease, mustard plasters, and onion poultices. If that didn't work, you might get a leech slapped on you, or worse, a dose of syrup laced with opium. Children were given soothing cordials that would horrify modern doctors but did at least knock them out for the night. Illness was expected. Enduring it with humor, blankets, and an endless supply of tea was the only real cure. Yet through all this, Victorians didn't just sit and suffer. They socialized. They played parlor games, told stories, wrote long letters full of complaints, and drank hot punch spiced enough to mask the taste of half-frozen fruit. Guests huddled around the fire, comparing who had the worst draft or the dampest socks, finding solidarity in shared misery. Parties became less about fun and more about body heat. Dancing wasn't elegance. It was exercise, the only way to keep circulation moving. That's the heart of it. Surviving a Victorian winter wasn't about any one trick. It was about stacking little comforts, an extra blanket, a stolen cat, a hot potato, a neighbor's recipe for mulled wine, until you cobbled together just enough warmth to last another night. And in that messy, smoky, frost-bitten struggle, they found community. They laughed, complained, argued, and carried on. So the next time your heater kicks in, or you wrap yourself in a fleece blanket, remember this. Once upon a time, survival meant potatoes in your pockets, bricks in your bed, and family piled together like a living quilt. Uncomfortable, definitely. Ridiculous, absolutely. But it worked. If you've made it this far into our Victorian snow globe of misery, you might be wondering, did they ever actually enjoy themselves? Believe it or not, yes. Even in the middle of frost-bitten nights, people found ways to make winter social, lively, and strangely entertaining. Because really, what's the point of surviving if you can't at least laugh about it? For starters, the parlor became the beating heart of winter life. Once a decent fire was coaxed into existence, a minor miracle itself, the entire household, neighbors included, gravitated toward it like moths. Imagine boots steaming, damp wool releasing clouds of questionable fragrance, children sprawled on rugs, adults balancing teacups, and someone inevitably hogging the prime spot right in front of the grate. The fire wasn't just heat, it was theater, it was gossip, it was community. Parties during winter had their own flavor. No one was throwing elaborate outdoor balls when sleet was slapping you sideways. Instead, they gathered indoors for evenings of mulled wine, music, and games. And here's the thing, movement was survival. Dancing wasn't about elegance. It was about circulation. Waltzing in stiff boots and multiple waistcoats wasn't glamorous, but it kept your toes attached. Games like charades, blind man's buff, and even impromptu rounds of musical chairs weren't just silly entertainment, they were cardio in disguise. One favorite, equal parts thrilling and terrifying, was Snapdragon. Picture this: raisins soaked in brandy, set alight in a dish, and then partygoers tried to snatch the flaming fruit with their bare hands before it burned their fingers or the curtains. It was less a game and more a festive insurance nightmare. Still, it was considered peak holiday cheer. Can you imagine your neighbors today playing Catch the Flaming Raisin? Probably not, but for Victorians it was proof that even in the coldest months, you could manufacture a little heat with laughter and maybe second-degree burns. Food and drink were central too. Hot punch was the superstar, wine or rum mixed with sugar, citrus, and spices, ladled steaming into mugs. Every host swore their recipe was the best, guaranteed to warm your soul and maybe cure your cough. Guests huddled close, trading stories of frozen pipes, draughty windows, and the eternal battle of chamber pots. And there was a strange joy in out-miserabling each other, in saying, "Oh, your kitchen froze solid. Well, our ceiling caved in from the ice last week." Misery, when shared, becomes comedy. But it wasn't all games and punch bowls. Faith and superstition carried enormous weight in the Victorian household during winter, when your survival hinged on fires that sputtered, food that spoiled, and illnesses that swept through entire families. You needed something bigger than wool socks to believe in. Prayers were whispered at bedtime, small blessings recited before stoking the hearth, and charms hung above doors to ward off evil drafts. A sprig of rosemary or lavender wasn't just decoration. It was insurance against both chills and spirits. Grandmothers especially held on to these rituals, swearing that sweeping the hearth in the wrong direction invited sickness, or that leaving bread uncovered at night tempted mischievous spirits. Children grew up repeating rhymes to keep Jack Frost away, half believing, half laughing, but fully participating because, what if it worked? Even skeptics joined in. When your survival depends on thin walls and colder beds, a little superstition feels like a sensible gamble. Letters written during winter reflect this perfectly. Page after page of elegant handwriting filled with dramatic descriptions. The frost has painted our windows with daggers again. Or, father attempted to relight the coal fire using last year's pudding. Results disastrous. These weren't just updates. They were therapy. They were how families spread both misery and humor across the miles. Complaints about damp bread or frozen water jugs became running jokes between relatives, keeping spirits alive when the cold threatened to crush them. And of course, nothing united Victorians more than complaining about the weather. It was practically a national sport. Neighbors met in shops, bundled in shawls and scarves, and instead of saying hello, they launched straight into temperature reports. Frost on the inside of the glass again. 3 icicles above the bed. You're lucky we lost a chamber pot to the freeze last night. These conversations, bleak as they sound, were their version of bonding. What's fascinating is how these social and spiritual habits gave people the strength to endure. Parties provided distraction, faith provided hope, letters provided connection, and communal complaining provided laughter. All together they created warmth that no coal fire could match. So while we picture Victorians shivering in silence, the truth is they were telling stories, inventing games, swapping jokes, and hanging rosemary sprigs with all the seriousness of generals at war. They weren't just surviving, they were creating a culture of resilience. And maybe that's the greatest lesson. In the darkest, coldest seasons, what really keeps people alive isn't just heat, it's each other. Let's talk about food. Because in a Victorian winter, eating wasn't just about flavor, it was about survival. Forget about Instagram-worthy plates and delicate seasoning. The average winter meal was somewhere between edible and character building. And if you managed to swallow it without breaking a tooth, you considered it a small miracle. The whole process started months earlier. Families spent summer and autumn frantically harvesting, pickling, salting, smoking, basically doing everything possible to bully nature into letting food last through the dead of winter. The root cellar was the crown jewel of survival. Picture a damp, shadowy basement stacked with barrels of turnips, potatoes, carrots, and whatever else didn't rot at first glance. If you descended those steps in December, it was like entering a dragon's lair, except instead of gold, the treasure was moldy vegetables and jars of mysterious preserves no one dared to open. Bread was both friend and foe. Fresh loaves vanished fast, leaving behind stale survivors that could be fried, toasted, or in emergencies, weaponized. There's a joke among historians that Victorian bread had more lives than a cat. Day 1, soft bread. Day 5, toast. Day 10, bread pudding. Day 20, insulation for the drafty window in the parlor. Families wasted nothing, because wasting food wasn't an option. And then there were the pies. Meat pies weren't dainty little treats. They were fortresses of survival. Packed with suet and heavy pastry, they could last weeks in the cold. But cutting into one was an adventure. Would you find juicy beef or a questionable surprise? Families joked, "Don't ask what's under the crust unless you really want to know." Some pies froze solid overnight, so children actually used them as makeshift hockey pucks in the yard before dinner. Preserved meat and salted fish also made appearances, though calling them appetizing would be generous. Salting was less science and more faith. You hoped the barrel would keep the meat edible, but every dinner carried the suspense of discovery. Was tonight's stew nourishing or nature's revenge? People buried eggs in lime, packed butter in crocks, and experimented with preservation tricks that sound more like witchcraft than cooking. Meals themselves were communal events. Families gathered in the kitchen, prying lids off pickle jars, scraping frost from butter, and debating whether the stew leaned more potato than turnip. On lucky days, a spoonful of jam appeared or a single apple sliced thin enough for everyone to pretend it counted as dessert. Children stared at the pot with a mix of hope and suspicion, already calculating how many meals they'd have to endure before spring. And here's the thing, flavor wasn't really the point. Calories were. Every spoonful was fuel against the cold. No one worried about carbs or sugar content. They worried about having enough to keep shoveling coal, hauling water, or just staying alive through another icy night. The cold drained energy fast, and food was the only real defense. But despite the bleak menus, there were moments of joy. A steaming cup of tea, even if the milk had frozen solid. A crust of bread dipped in broth that somehow tasted better when shared. Families joked, complained, and made the most of what they had. Because in the end, winter meals weren't just about filling stomachs. They were about reminding everyone they were still in it together. So next time you toss out stale bread or complain about leftovers, remember, a Victorian family would have fought over that crust, declared it delightful, and probably written about it in a letter to their cousins. Hey guys, so let's be real. Even in the coldest winters, people don't just sit silently staring at frozen porridge and damp socks. Humans crave company, and for Victorians, winter was the perfect excuse to huddle together, light a fire, and pretend that frostbite was just another party guest. A Victorian winter party wasn't glamorous by modern standards. Think fewer sequins, more steaming mugs of questionable punch. But in those long, freezing months, an invitation to a neighbor's parlor was like winning the lottery, not because you'd hear the best gossip or see the latest fashions, but because it meant you'd spend a few hours in a room that was actually warm. The fireplace was the true celebrity of any gathering. Guests jockeyed for position like contestants in a reality show. The lucky ones scored the coveted seats closest to the flames. Everyone else formed layers of humanity behind them, shivering politely, inching forward whenever someone looked distracted. Boots steamed, gloves sizzled, and skirts dried into stiff sculptures by the end of the night. Now, let's talk refreshments. If you picture delicate finger sandwiches, think again. Winter party menus were simple, hearty, and designed to deliver maximum warmth. The star was hot punch, wine or spirits mixed with fruit, spices, and enough heat to blur the line between medicine and mischief. One sip and suddenly Aunt Edith was belting out ballads she swore she'd forgotten, while Uncle George attempted to waltz with the umbrella stand. Kids begged for a taste but usually got barley water or weak cocoa and still felt like they were part of the fun. Entertainment was another survival strategy. Dancing wasn't just for merriment, it was a workout. When your house was colder than the street, you didn't dance to impress. You danced to keep blood flowing to your toes. Snapdragon was a holiday favorite. Raisins soaked in brandy, lit on fire, and snatched barehanded by laughing, slightly singed partygoers. Because nothing says Christmas cheer like trying not to set your sleeve alight. Charades, card games, and musical chairs filled in the quieter moments. And let's be honest, half the entertainment came from complaining together. Victorians loved to outdo each other in tales of misery. Whose windows had the thickest frost, whose hot water bottle had betrayed them, whose chamber pot had frozen solid overnight. There was a strange joy in misery shared, almost like a badge of honor. If you could make the room laugh with your story of suffering, you won the evening. Fashion rules went out the frosted window. No one cared if you wore 3 scarves and borrowed your grandmother's shawl. Winter gatherings were the one place everyone silently agreed that survival trumped style. Still, there was always that one guest showing off their fur muff, a luxurious hand warmer that doubled as a conversation starter, and rumor had it, a secret snack storage. By the time the party wound down, guests were fortified not just by hot punch and parlor games, but by the reminder that they weren't facing the cold alone. They bundled themselves back into layers upon layers, bracing for the icy trek home, secretly grateful for the warmth they'd borrowed for a few hours. And that's the heart of it. Victorian winter parties weren't about elegance or extravagance. They were about resilience, humor, and the stubborn human refusal to let the cold win. So picture this. You've stuffed rags into every crack. You've layered so many socks you can't feel your feet. You've even bribed the cat into sleeping on your toes. And yet the cold keeps winning. What do you do when science, scarves, and sarcasm all fail? If you're a Victorian, you turn to faith, superstition, and a pinch of desperation. Because for Victorians, winter wasn't just about battling frost. It was about battling fate. The fire in the hearth wasn't just warmth, it was a symbol. Lighting it became a ritual almost like prayer. Some families whispered wishes as they poked the embers, begging the flames to last until morning. Mothers crossed themselves before opening the oven door, as if the bread would rise better under divine supervision. Children recited little blessings as they rushed into bed, hoping the angels, or at least Jack Frost, would take pity on them that night. Superstitions filled every corner of the house. A sprig of rosemary over the doorway wasn't for smell. It was a charm to keep evil drafts away. Dried orange peels, lavender bundles, and even onion skins were strung from beams, not as decoration but as talismans. Grandma might swear that sweeping the hearth clockwise kept sickness out, but sweeping counterclockwise doomed the family to cold dinners and endless sniffles. Did it work? Of course not. But it gave people the feeling that they were fighting back. That winter didn't have the final say. The calendar became another battlefield. Every small sign was interpreted as a message. Candlemas meant spring might be near, or that winter still had weeks of vengeance left. The sight of the first snowdrop or crocus was analyzed like a stock report. Was it a good omen? Or would another blizzard bury it by dawn? Even robins were suspected of carrying messages, hope, doom, or simply hunger. Entire family debates spun out of whether the moon looked friendly enough to suggest a mild March. And let's not forget the weather prophets of the day. Grandfathers, vicars, nosy neighbors, they all offered predictions, usually wrong but always delivered with solemn authority. This frost will break by Tuesday, someone would declare, only for the whole house to wake up Wednesday to icicles longer than a sword. Did people learn? Not really. The ritual of guessing and arguing about the weather was as warming as the fire itself. Then came the charms against illness. Salt sprinkled on the doorstep, garlic hung in the kitchen, a half-burned candle kept by the bed. Families sang songs or muttered little spells meant to drive the cold out. Some children even slipped hopeful notes under their pillows, praying spring spirits would read them overnight and bring mercy. It was half faith, half theater, but all survival. Because here's the truth. None of these rituals actually raised the temperature inside. But they did something else, something just as important. They gave people structure, a way to believe they had some small power against the relentless cold. Superstition filled the silence of long nights, gave children stories to hold on to, and reminded adults that hope mattered almost as much as coal. And when the first flowers finally pushed through the frost, it felt like a miracle granted, not by physics or thermodynamics, but by sheer stubborn belief. That's the magic of Victorian winters. When blankets, bricks, and even hot potatoes failed, faith and folklore stepped in to keep spirits alive. You've made it through months of frozen chamber pots, smoky coal fires, and nights spent huddled in a pile of relatives like human lasagna. And then one morning, something's different. You wake up, breathe out, and for the first time since November, your breath isn't fogging the window. That's right, spring has finally decided to show up, fashionably late as always. The first sign, toes. Everyone checks their toes. It's like the unofficial family census. You wiggle them one by one, amazed they are still attached after a winter spent numb, blue, and plotting mutiny. Siblings compare notes like war veterans. Still got all 10. Someone brags. Another sheepishly admits their pinky toe hasn't forgiven them since January. These little toe audits become a family tradition, equal parts relief and comedy. The house itself also looks like it's survived a siege. The wallpaper is stained from months of condensation. The ceiling still smells faintly of coal smoke, and the kitchen floor carries mysterious scorch marks from fire experiments. But now, windows are thrown wide open with a triumphant flare. Fresh air gushes in, sweeping out the layered perfume of boiled cabbage, wet dog, and damp wool. Everyone inhales like it's champagne. Even the cat, normally a winter trader, struts around as if it personally negotiated the season change. Quilts and blankets are hauled outside, shaken like they are being exorcised. Rugs are beaten within an inch of their lives. Mattresses are dragged into the yard, airing out months of trapped dreams, secrets, and a faint hint of goose grease. Somewhere, a long-lost glove is discovered in the garden hedge, instantly claimed as someone's lucky survivor. Spring also means retiring winter's heroes. The hot water bottle, chipped but loyal, is polished and set back on the shelf like a war medal. Bricks that once moonlighted as bed warmers are returned to the garden wall. The family even holds a mock ceremony, thanking potatoes for their noble service as pocket hand warmers, before promptly baking them into a pie. And then comes the garden parade. Everyone, from grandfather to toddler, steps cautiously into the muddy yard, blinking at the sunlight like cave dwellers seeing fire for the first time. Boots sink into slush, chickens stumble around bewildered, and the family dog loses its mind rediscovering grass. It's messy, it's damp, it's glorious. Meals shift too. The last of the wrinkled turnips and fossilized bread crusts are finally eaten, more out of ceremony than necessity. Soon, fresh greens sprout and the kitchen smells less like survival and more like possibility. Tea tastes brighter, soup feels lighter, and there's even talk of bathing. Real bathing, not just dabbing yourself with a damp cloth and praying nobody notices. But the biggest change is mood. For months, laughter was muffled under layers of wool and complaint. Now people laugh more freely. Children run in the yard without fear of freezing mid-step. Adults sit by windows instead of fires, gossiping about gardens, weddings, or anything that doesn't involve frostbite. Even neighbors, once locked in competition over coal supplies, nod with genuine warmth instead of grim solidarity. Spring doesn't erase the hardships, but it reframes them. Every scar on the floorboards, every soot stain, every story about frozen chamber pots becomes part of a collective victory. We survived, people say, not with arrogance but with gratitude, and maybe, just maybe, with a little swagger. Because if you can outlast a Victorian winter, you've earned the right to strut barefoot in April sunshine. So when you throw open your window tonight, listen. Somewhere, beneath the thawing soil, past the smell of coal and cabbage, you might still hear the echo of Victorian laughter. Not because life was easy, but because spring always came. If winter inside the Victorian home was a battlefield against drafts and frozen water jugs, then outside it was a whole other kind of war. A social chess game built on coal, gossip, and neighborly negotiations that ranged from polite to downright sneaky. Coal wasn't just fuel. It was status, survival, and the closest thing to currency when the frost hit hardest. Imagine watching the family coal pile shrink each day, like sand slipping through an hourglass. Every lump suddenly became a moral decision. Do we burn it tonight and sleep warm, or save it for tomorrow and risk everyone turning into human icicles? Families rationed coal with the precision of military generals, counting each scuttle as if it were gold bars. But here's the twist. No matter how carefully you planned, you always ran out before the next delivery. And that's when the real community spirit kicked in. Sometimes it meant knocking on a neighbor's door with a smile that said, "We're desperate but trying to be dignified." Other times it meant slipping across the garden in the dead of night, scooping a handful of coal from the neighbor's pile, and praying the chickens didn't rat you out. Everyone pretended they didn't do it, but trust me, everyone did. There was even etiquette to coal borrowing. You never took more than a few lumps. You always returned the bucket, and if caught, the excuse was universal. The cat knocked it over. The unspoken rule was simple. Don't shame your neighbor for stealing coal, because next week it'll probably be you sneaking across the hedge with a lantern and a guilty conscience. Wood scraps, rags, even broken furniture joined the economy of winter survival. Families burned chair legs, old boots, or last year's Christmas decorations if it came down to it. One kid might accidentally drop homework too close to the fire just to keep the flames alive a little longer. Desperate times called for desperate creativity. And then there was the great exchange of favors. A borrowed hot brick, a pot of broth passed through a gate, a neighbor's kid sent to sit by your fire in exchange for helping with chores. Winter blurred the lines between households. Suddenly, everyone's misery was everyone's business. If Mrs. Turner's fire went out, you could bet half the street knew about it by morning, and at least one person would march over with kindling, partly out of kindness, partly because no one wanted the smell of another frozen neighbor haunting their conscience. Social gatherings in winter also doubled as survival hacks. Sure, people called them parlor visits or tea evenings, but let's be real. They were excuses to cram as many bodies as possible into one semi-heated room. More people meant more warmth, more laughter, and fewer chances of hearing your teeth chatter like a broken tambourine. Guests would linger suspiciously long by the fire, sipping endless cups of tea, until the host finally hinted that the embers were dying and it was time to shuffle home. Even churches became unofficial heating stations. Sermons were long, but not just for the sake of piety. A packed chapel meant shared warmth, and no one complained if the preacher droned on about sin for an extra half hour. After all, repentance was warmer than the frost outside. Yet beneath all this communal survival, there was competition too. People judged how much smoke was rising from your chimney. Too much and you were a coal waster. Too little and maybe you were stingy, or worse, secretly freezing but too proud to admit it. Winter turned every street into a theater of survival, with curtains of frost and smoke signaling who was thriving and who was barely scraping by. But through all of it, borrowing, stealing, complaining, rationing, there was a strange kind of solidarity. Everyone was in the same freezing boat, and that created a bond. You might never share family secrets, but you'd share a lump of coal when it mattered. And that tiny exchange could mean the difference between another miserable night and a survivable one. So next time you adjust your thermostat without a second thought, remember, in Victorian times, warmth wasn't just about survival. It was about community, pride, and the quiet understanding that even in the coldest season, nobody truly survived alone. Imagine this. It's the middle of January, your socks are stiff, the fire is sulking in the grate, and you've already eaten your weight in turnips. What do? In Victorian England, the answer was simple: throw a party. Now, don't picture chandeliers, champagne fountains, and ballrooms filled with glitter. Most Victorian winter gatherings were less royal gala and more please God, let's not freeze alone tonight. The moment an invitation arrived, it wasn't just about music or mince pies. It was about survival. A warm room was a rare luxury, and the promise of even a few hours near someone else's fire was worth braving icy cobblestones and frostbitten ears. Guests arrived bundled like human cabbages. Scarves, shawls, muffs, mittens, and occasionally a curtain repurposed as outerwear all came off in layers at the door. If you were lucky, you still recognized your friends underneath. The entryway became a mountain of wool and damp boots, each pair dripping thawing misery onto the floorboards. The parlor, though, the parlor was the prize. It glowed with a coal fire, its smoke half suffocating, half divine. Guests crowded close, jockeying for prime positions. The clever ones claimed a seat early and clung to it like a throne, feigning deep interest in the mantelpiece's dusty porcelain dogs. Everyone else had to hover on the periphery, smiling through chattering teeth and hoping the person nearest the fire shifted a little to the left. And because simply sitting still meant your blood would freeze, there was entertainment. Games weren't just for fun, they were circulation. Snapdragon, the notorious party game, involved snatching flaming raisins out of a bowl of brandy. Dangerous, absolutely. But for a brief second, your fingers felt something other than numbness. Musical chairs, charades, or even an impromptu jig served the same purpose. Movement kept you alive. Music was everywhere too. Someone would sit at the pianoforte and hammer out a tune, while others hummed along, half for merriment, half to hide the sound of their stomachs growling. Dancing was less about grace and more about friction. Shuffle fast enough and maybe your toes wouldn't fall off. Food and drink carried their own kind of magic. A steaming bowl of punch, spiced with cloves and optimism, was passed around like holy water. Each sip thawed just enough of your soul to keep you from despair. Children begged for cocoa, though most ended up with barley water or weak tea. Adults drank mulled wine until cheeks glowed pink, disguising frostbite as festive cheer. But here's the real entertainment: complaining. Victorians were masters of misery, and nothing bonded people faster than swapping tales of frozen pipes, chimney smoke disasters, or the time your hot water bottle betrayed you. Guests leaned in, eyes wide, relishing each other's suffering like it was the finest gossip. Whoever had the worst winter story won unofficial bragging rights until spring. And let's not forget the fashion spectacle, though fashion is generous. Nobody judged if you showed up in 3 petticoats, a bonnet shaped like a collapsing cake, or gloves that looked suspiciously like socks. Winter gatherings were the one time social rules bent. If you waddled in looking like a penguin wrapped in Granny's curtains, everyone just nodded in solidarity. By the end of the night, the fire had burned low. The air smelled like wool and mulled wine, and laughter mixed with coughs in a haze of smoky camaraderie. Guests bundled back into their frozen armor, braced for the carriage ride or trudge home. Yet they left with lighter hearts, cheeks a little warmer, and the quiet satisfaction of having turned sheer survival into something resembling joy. That was the secret of Victorian winter parties. They weren't elegant, they weren't glamorous, but they kept people sane. Because sometimes the best way to survive wasn't just with coal or blankets. It was with stories, songs, and the warmth of each other's company. We've talked about blankets, fires, hot bricks, and even communal cuddle puddles. But let me tell you, when all else failed, Victorians didn't just fight the cold with wool and coal. They fought it with faith, superstition, and a little bit of old-fashioned magical thinking. Picture this. It's February, the house is groaning with frost, your breath hangs in the air like a ghost, and your fingers are so numb you can't button your shirt. What do? You pray. You cross yourself before opening the oven. You whisper a blessing as you lay kindling in the grate, as if the fire itself has ears. Because in Victorian homes, stoking a flame wasn't just maintenance, it was ritual. Every ember carried a wish. Mothers murmured short prayers that the fire would hold through the night. Fathers muttered oaths to household gods that didn't technically exist, but in that icy dark, you believed anything was listening. Children recited little charms on their way to bed, hoping the shadows would stay shadows and not turn into something worse. Superstition filled in the gaps science couldn't. Grandmother swore that hanging rosemary over the door kept out both witches and cold drafts. Lavender bundles dangled from beams, orange peels tucked behind shutters. Did they work? Who knows? But at least they smelled better than wet dog and cabbage stew. Some rituals were almost comical. Sweep the hearth one way and you supposedly swept illness out of the house. Sweep it the other way and you invited a year of misfortune. A sprig of holly in the rafters was said to keep out frost sprites. Salt on the doorstep kept sickness, or sometimes just your neighbor's cat from crossing the threshold. Even the calendar itself became a source of prophecy. Candlemas, Groundhog Day, the first snowdrop bloom. Every sign was studied like scripture. Was the moon waning? Did a robin perch on the fence? Each little omen was weighed and debated over porridge like it was stock market advice. Entire evenings were spent analyzing whether spring might come early or if you were doomed to 3 more months of misery. And then there was music. Some families sang old songs to drive away the cold. Others tucked hopeful messages under pillows, praying the spirits of spring might read them. Some wrote entire letters to the future, promising to be better, braver, or at least finally fix the draft in the cellar if only winter would loosen its grip. Of course, these charms didn't change the temperature. The frost still crept across your window panes, the chamber pot still froze, and your toes still ached. But that wasn't really the point. Faith and superstition gave people structure. It turned long, endless nights into rituals. It gave you something to do besides sit and count your shivers. And most importantly, it bound families together. Instead of silently suffering, you whispered blessings over the fire, tucked herbs into corners, and sang songs no one really believed would help, but everyone hoped they might. Because hope itself was warmth. And in a Victorian winter, sometimes hope was the only thing that kept you going until spring finally cracked the ice. Imagine this. After months of icy windows, frozen chamber pots, and family huddles that looked more like survival packs than bedtime rituals, something changes. You wake up one morning, breathe out, and for the first time since November, your breath doesn't fog the air. It's subtle at first. A faint drip outside as the icicles hanging from the eaves surrender to the sun. The draft under the kitchen door no longer feels like a personal attack from the Arctic. And then the most shocking moment of all, your mother actually cracks open a window. Not to chase out a smell, but because, for once, it's warmer outside than in. This is Victorian spring. Suspicious, tentative, almost unbelievable. Everyone in the house reacts like survivors crawling out of a cave. Blankets are peeled off. Coats and shawls are hung up, though never too far away because no one trusts the weather just yet. And children rediscover the joy of wiggling toes they weren't entirely sure they'd kept through the winter. Toe counting became almost a seasonal ritual. One by one, each sibling lifts their socks, checking digits like they're greeting old friends. 10 toes. Congratulations, you win. 9. Still a victory. That little pinky that spent February flirting with frostbite. It's alive, though it might hold a grudge until August. Siblings brag about how few layers of socks they needed. One claims, "I never wore more than 2 pairs, not once," as if that's a badge of honor. Then comes the ceremonial parade into the yard. Boots are tested for leaks, children slosh through muddy patches, and the family dog explodes with joy, rediscovering the garden like it's a brand new continent. The cat, of course, steps outside, sniffs the damp ground, and promptly goes back in, muttering that spring is overrated. But the relief is real. The worst of the coughs has passed, the fever blankets are put away, and the last jars of onion poultices are quietly buried in the garden like evidence of a crime. Family meetings, once dominated by draft-proofing strategies, now turn to hopeful plans, airing out quilts, planting potatoes, maybe even cleaning the soot off the walls. Optimism feels strange, like a muscle that hasn't been used in months. The house itself tells the story of survival. Floorboards scarred by spilled water during frozen pipe disasters. Quilts stiff with months of condensation. A lingering perfume of coal dust, wet wool, and cabbage stew that refuses to leave, even as you throw open every window. Siblings drag mattresses outside, flapping them in the breeze as if shaking out nightmares. Somewhere in the hedge, a missing glove is finally found, now permanently claimed by the garden. The hot water bottle is retired with a kind of ceremony. It's placed proudly on a shelf, scarred from leaks and scorches, but honored as the household hero. The family gives it a few affectionate pats, promising to call it back into service next November. For now, it can rest. By April, You feel lighter even if your boots are still caked in mud. Surviving a Victorian winter doesn't make you elegant, it makes you triumphant. You didn't win against the cold. Nobody ever really wins against a Victorian winter, but you endured it, you laughed at it, and you carried enough toes, fingers, and humor through to make it to another season. And that in itself was victory. Spring didn't just mean warmth. It meant survival. It meant the worst was over. And for a few precious months, you could finally stretch your limbs without feeling like a stuffed sausage wrapped in 10 layers of wool. Let's talk about windows. In the Victorian world, they were supposed to be symbols of elegance, tall, framed in wood, sometimes decorated with lace curtains. But in winter, they were the enemy. Draughty, rattling, and about as useful against the cold as a slice of Swiss cheese nailed to the wall. Every morning began with the same dilemma. Someone would glance at the glass, see frost feathers creeping across the panes, and whisper the eternal question: do we risk opening it? Do we let in a breath of fresh air, or do we stay sealed up and marinate in a mix of damp wool, cabbage stew, and coal smoke? It was never an easy choice. Victorian doctors didn't make it easier. One day they'd lecture that stale air was dangerous, that miasma caused sickness. The next, they'd warn that letting in a draft was practically suicide. So families argued endlessly. Fresh air versus warmth, health versus toes, sanity versus frostbite. Breakfast was often delayed by debates louder than the church bells outside. The truth was, windows weren't designed for survival. The sashes rattled at the slightest breeze. The gaps around the frame funneled icy air directly onto ankles and necks. No matter how many rags you stuffed into the cracks, some invisible laser beam of cold always found its way in. Families invented all sorts of defenses, pinning heavy velvet curtains over the panes, taping up newspapers, even shoving entire chairs against the frames to keep them shut. But still, the cold laughed and slipped through. On rare mornings, someone would get bold. They'd fling a window open for ventilation. The entire family braced as if preparing for a battle. Scarves tightened, towels grabbed, children hid under tables. The rush of icy air swept through like an invading army, freezing porridge mid-spoon and frosting the butter before it reached the bread. Within seconds, the experiment ended in chaos. Windows slammed, everyone shivering, and the culprit exiled to fire duty for the week. Of course, keeping windows sealed came with its own side effects. The parlor slowly transformed into what could only be described as a living museum of smells. Socks drying by the fire, boots steaming in the corner, wool sweaters slowly fermenting on chairs. Add in the ever-present perfume of boiled cabbage, and you had an atmosphere so thick you could practically chew it. Visitors learned to smile politely, nod, and say, "Ah yes, it certainly smells like winter this year." And yet, windows had their strange beauty. Frost painted them every night: ferns, spirals, diamonds, feathers. Children pressed their noses against the patterns, told stories about Jack Frost visiting in the night, and scraped little peepholes to spy on the outside world. It was art. It was poetry. It was also a daily reminder that you were living inside a decorated icebox. By March, the window wars reached their breaking point. Families gave up on arguing and simply chose sides. One group camped in the parlor, swearing the air would suffocate them. The other huddled in bedrooms, swearing that one more draft would kill them faster. Cats solved the problem by sneaking out through the tiniest cracks, only to reappear hours later smug and frost-free. And through it all, The window remained what it always was in a Victorian winter, a cruel joke, a piece of architecture designed to frame the outside world, but really just another battlefield in the endless war against the cold. You admired its beauty for 3 seconds, then cursed it for the rest of the day. Because in Victorian times, a window wasn't just a window. It was a daily gamble with your health, your sanity, and your last warm spoonful of porridge. Imagine this. It's the middle of January, the wind is howling like a pack of wolves outside, and your family has gathered in the parlor, staring not at the Bible, not at a painting, but at the coal scuttle. That battered little bucket wasn't just metal, it was survival. Every single lump of coal inside was a ticket to one more hour of warmth, one more night without frostbite chewing at your toes. Coal was the obsession of every Victorian household. You could have fancy wallpaper, a polished dining table, even a piano no one knew how to play. But without coal, you were just another group of shivering mortals waiting for spring. And the coal man, he wasn't just a tradesman. He was a hero, a villain, and sometimes a grim reaper, all rolled into one. His arrival was unmistakable. First, the grind of cart wheels on frozen cobblestone, then the sharp thud-thud of sacks landing on the stoop. Children ran to the windows, pressing their noses against the frost, watching as the great black treasure was carried up the path. He'd appear, broad-shouldered, soot in his beard, boots leaving little avalanches of coal dust behind. With a single grunt, he let you know how much he respected, or didn't respect, your ability to pay. Then came the negotiations. Fathers stood with arms crossed, trying to look stern. Mothers hovered with the ledger, counting coins like a general rationing gunpowder. The delivery always seemed smaller than what you remembered ordering, suspiciously smaller. And yet you handed over the money, grimacing as if you were parting with family silver. Coal wasn't just fuel, it was currency. Comfort traded for shillings, warmth measured in lumps. And coal dust, oh, the coal dust. It invaded everything. The floors, the curtains, the dog's fur, even the butter if you weren't careful. Months later, you'd still find smudges behind the bread bin or in your socks. Some people swore coal dust was good for the complexion. That was usually said by people who had never spent an afternoon scrubbing it off the furniture. But here's the real nightmare: running out. Watching the coal pile shrink day by day was like watching an hourglass bleed out. Families guarded their supply with the paranoia of misers. One more scuttle before bed? Absolutely not. Not unless you wanted a shouting match that could wake the dead. Coal became a family drama, rationed like medicine, argued over like inheritance. When the bucket finally ran low, desperation set in. Suddenly, everything flammable was on the table. Newspapers, broken furniture, sticks scavenged from the yard. Children were sent on adventures to collect twigs, while fathers muttered about whether it was really stealing if you borrowed a lump or two from the neighbor's pile and promised to repay it someday. Everyone pretended it didn't happen. Everyone knew it did. Still, when the fire was lit, when the coals finally caught, glowing orange and alive, there was nothing more beautiful. Families crowded the hearth like pilgrims at a shrine. Socks steamed, dogs sprawled belly up, faces softened in the flickering light. For a few fleeting hours, you could forget the drafts, the frozen pipes, the endless dampness. You had heat. You had hope. And then came the great silence, the moment when the fire sputtered out. The panic was immediate. Who was supposed to tend the embers? Who forgot to add a lump before bed? Fingers pointed. Legends told. Aunt Mabel once let the fire go out, the story went, and she was never seen again. She actually moved to Brighton, but why ruin a good ghost tale? The truth is, coal wasn't just fuel in the Victorian winter. It was theater. Every delivery, every rationing argument, every frantic midnight scramble to relight a dying fire was a performance in the grand drama of survival. And if you made it to spring with a few lumps still in the scuttle, you weren't just lucky. You were royalty. It's midnight in a Victorian bedroom. The wind rattles the shutters, frost flowers bloom across the window pane, and your bed looks about as inviting as a block of ice. Then salvation arrives. Not a hot water bottle, not a pet cat, but a gleaming brass warming pan carried up the stairs like it's the Holy Grail. A warming pan looked innocent enough. A shallow metal dish on a long handle, polished until it could blind you in candlelight. But inside, glowing hot coals scooped straight from the hearth. The lid clamped shut, engraved with hopeful little designs, flowers, birds, swirls that whispered civilized comfort, when in reality it was basically a portable fire hazard you tucked under your sheets. The ritual was as nerve-wracking as it was necessary. Someone, usually the bravest or the most disposable family member, would collect the coals, tip them into the pan, and clamp it tight. Then, with the care you'd reserve for carrying nitroglycerin, they'd haul it upstairs. Every creak of the handle, every hiss of the embers, was a reminder that one slip meant the curtains might catch fire and the night would end in chaos. Sliding the pan between the sheets was its own ceremony. Would tonight be bliss or disaster? Sometimes it worked perfectly. You slipped into bed and felt warmth spreading like a miracle across the frozen linen. For the first time all week, your toes thawed and you almost believed winter wasn't so bad. But other nights, the coals burned too hot, scorching the bedding, branding unlucky sleepers, or worse, smoldering into a slow, smoky catastrophe that had everyone leaping out of bed, coughing and swearing. Timing was everything. Leave it in too long and you got sheets that smelled like charred feathers. Too short, and you may as well have tucked a potato in there. Families had their own strategies. Some appointed a test hand, usually the youngest sibling, sent to poke the sheets and report whether the bed was warm enough yet. Others developed elaborate rules. Move the pan in circles, don't leave it near the pillows, and for heaven's sake, check it twice before removing it. Despite the risks, the warming pan had its admirers. In fact, it became a kind of household celebrity. Families passed them down like heirlooms, polishing them until you could see your shivering reflection. Having a warming pan wasn't just about heat. It was about status. It said, we may freeze half the year, but we freeze in style. And of course, Victorians being Victorians, they turned the warming pan into a social subject. Guests would nod approvingly at a particularly shiny example hanging in the hallway, while privately wondering how many scorch marks lay hidden on the family's sheets. Children told ghost stories about pans that burst open at night, releasing not just coals but fiery spirits. Servants, who usually had the job of handling the dangerous contraptions, muttered curses and prayed for the invention of central heating. Even the cat wasn't safe. More than one family pet learned the hard way that a bed suddenly radiating warmth was not to be trusted. There were stories of singed whiskers and dogs leaping out of beds yelping. Still, the alternative, climbing into sheets so cold they felt carved from marble, kept people loyal to their brass pan of questionable mercy. Morning was its own aftermath. If you were lucky, the sheets were toasty and intact, and you woke with nothing worse than a faint smoky aroma in the air. If not, you were left with scorched linens, a sheepish explanation to the rest of the household, and maybe a permanent mark burned into the mattress. But always, someone shrugged and said the same thing. Well, at least we were warm for a little while. The warming pan was more than an object. It was a metaphor for Victorian life itself. Ingenuity born from desperation, elegance hiding danger, and comfort balanced on the edge of catastrophe. They risked fire, burns, and ruined bedding for just a few fleeting minutes of warmth. And somehow, to them, it was worth it. Because in the Victorian winter, when drafts stalked the hallways and frost claimed every window, even a risky bed of glowing embers felt like a small slice of heaven. Let's imagine this. The fire is sputtering, your breath fogs in the parlor, and there's nothing left to do but pull out a sheet of paper and start writing. In Victorian England, letter writing wasn't just polite, it was survival. Think about it. There were no phones, no WhatsApp groups, no midnight memes. If you wanted to vent about how your water jug had frozen solid again, or how your father nearly burned down the house trying to light damp coal, you picked up a pen. And in winter, those letters became epic sagas of discomfort. Dearest cousin Elizabeth, one might begin. I write to you wrapped in 4 shawls, 2 blankets, and my brother's discarded scarf. The temperature is somewhere between Arctic and meat locker. The ink froze almost as fast as the ink bottle, and every sentence was both a report and a cry for sympathy. Letters weren't just about the weather, though. They were about gossip. Who in the neighborhood had resorted to wearing curtains as trousers? Which uncle had given up and gone to bed in all his waistcoats at once? Who stole the family cat to use as a foot warmer? Every winter disaster became entertainment for distant relatives. And these weren't quick notes. Victorians prided themselves on pages upon pages of looping script. You could almost feel the frostbite in the handwriting. Ink blotted by trembling fingers, paragraphs trailing off where someone had to stop and blow on their hands to keep them moving. The post itself was an adventure. Imagine trudging down a frozen lane with your letter tucked inside 3 layers of paper, sealed with wax, hoping it wouldn't shatter like glass before it reached the post box. The postman, swaddled in so many layers he looked like a walking haystack, would stagger up the path, delivering correspondence and a side order of frostbite. He was half Santa Claus, half survivalist. And when a letter arrived, pure joy. Families would gather around the table, kettle whistling in the background, everyone leaning in to hear the news from far away. It didn't matter if the message was 3 weeks old. For one evening, it was as if the outside world had cracked open your frozen bubble. Of course, the best letters always contained culinary horror stories. Cousins wrote about potatoes so hard they could chip teeth, turnip pies with the texture of roofing tiles, or butter so solid it doubled as furniture. And everyone added their own plea at the end. Please, for the love of all that is holy, someone invent central heating. Sometimes the letters grew darkly funny. One family might brag that their pipes only burst once that week, while another described how their chamber pot froze solid and had to be carried out like an Olympic trophy. Complaining became an art form, each household trying to outdo the other with the most creative suffering. And yet, hidden beneath all the moaning and melodrama, there was something tender. These letters were lifelines, proof that you weren't alone in the endless dark of February. Proof that even as you shivered, laughed, and fought over the last lump of coal, someone out there was listening. When spring finally came and the first crocuses bloomed, many of those letters were bundled up and saved. a record of survival, a reminder that families endured, laughed, and even found humor in the hardest season. So next time you tap out a quick text complaining that your thermostat is on the fritz, think of your Victorian counterpart, ink-stained fingers wrapped in shawls, scrawling dramatic prose by candlelight. They weren't just writing letters. They were writing history, one freezing, funny page at a time. The windows are frosted over, and the house creaks like it's trying to remind you that winter owns the place. Outside, the streets are empty, horses snort clouds of steam, and the lamps glow dim in the fog. But inside is where the real survival game begins. Victorian evenings weren't quiet, cozy affairs like the oil paintings might suggest. They were strategic missions of endurance. The fire was the star of the night. If it lived, the family lived. If it sputtered out, the whole household turned into an icebox. So everyone crowded close, faces red from the heat on one side and pale from the drafts on the other. Picture the scene. Socks stretched out by the hearth, a dog sprawled belly up in front of the flames, kids fighting over the one good chair. Steam rose from wet boots lined along the grate, turning the room into a foggy mix of smoke, wool, and hope. The fire crackled like a drumbeat, and every so often someone poked it nervously, as if afraid it might decide to quit. This was also storytelling time. With no radio, no Netflix, and not enough candles to waste on boredom, families told stories. Some were funny, tales of neighbors slipping on icy cobblestones or someone's chamber pot disaster. Some were spooky, ghost stories about spirits wandering through winter fog, or legends of Jack Frost scratching patterns on windows. And some were simply personal, small triumphs of the day, like managing to get water from the well without breaking the jug. And of course, there was complaining, a favorite Victorian sport. The father would groan about the coal man shortchanging them. The mother would sigh about drafts sneaking through the parlor, and the children would argue over whose turn it was with the hot water bottle. Complaints weren't just venting, they were bonding. In the firelight, misery became comedy, and everyone laughed just enough to forget that their toes were still numb. Games filled the gaps between stories. Cards, charades, even a rowdy round of Snapdragon. Yes, the one where you set raisins on fire and dared each other to grab them before they burned your fingers. Dangerous, absolutely. But it kept the blood pumping. Some families sang, voices rising above the crackle of the fire, carrying warmth through the rafters. Even the silences were powerful. Imagine a hush settling over the room, only the fire's glow flickering across tired faces. A child leaning against their mother's shoulder. A grandmother knitting slowly, her needles clicking in rhythm with the wind rattling the shutters. Those quiet moments carried their own kind of heat, the warmth of simply being together. And when bedtime finally came, it wasn't about luxury. It was strategy. Every ember was banked carefully, coal added just so the fire wouldn't die before dawn. Parents whispered small prayers over the hearth, hoping it would last the night. Children trudged off to bed in layers of flannel, still giggling about ghost stories, while the dog curled up as the unofficial guard of warmth. To us, a Victorian winter night might sound like hardship wrapped in smoke and wool. But to them, it was life. It was the rhythm of endurance, of family pressed close, of laughter echoing against frozen walls. Nights like that carved resilience into their bones and gave us the stories we tell today. So after a long day of shivering, hauling coal, and battling drafts, the Victorian family finally gathered for supper. And let me tell you, this was not some grand feast out of a Dickens novel. Most nights, it was survival cuisine at its finest, food that could keep you alive, not necessarily make you happy. Picture the kitchen. A heavy wooden table scarred by decades of knives and elbows, the air smoky from the coal fire, and the faint smell of boiled cabbage lingering like an uninvited guest. On the table sat a pot, always a pot, because stew was the undisputed king of winter meals. What went in the stew? Whatever survived the cellar. Carrots, turnips, onions, maybe a piece of salted pork if fortune smiled. On lean nights, it was just root vegetables simmering into something you politely called broth. The bread basket was another adventure. Fresh loaves were a rare luxury, usually devoured within the first week of baking. By midwinter, bread was hard enough to defend your home with. Families dunked it in soup just to soften the edges, each bite crunching like you were chewing a piece of furniture. Butter, when it appeared, was spread with the delicacy of a jeweler polishing a diamond, thin, careful, precious. And then there was pudding. No, not the sweet custard we think of today, but dense, heavy, meat-laced creations packed into suet and flour, the kind of dish you ate with determination, not delight. If you were lucky, there might be a treacle tart or a bit of jam saved from summer. If not, dessert was a wistful thought. But supper wasn't just about calories, it was about community. The family crowded close to the range, bowls in hand, steam fogging up every surface. Laughter rose between complaints, the dog hovered hopefully under the table, and the cat eyed the butter as if plotting a heist. Stories flowed, who slipped on the ice, whose scarf caught fire, who dreamed last night of spring. Food was thin, but conversation was rich. And let's not forget the drinks. Tea was the holy grail, strong and hot, with milk chipped from a frozen jug if you had any. Ale or hot punch made appearances too, warming more than just the throat. Children sometimes got weak cocoa, though it was usually more water than chocolate. But in that moment, with a warm mug in hand, everyone felt like royalty. Of course, dinner came with its own dramas. Someone always complained their portion was smaller, or that the stew had too much turnip. A spoon would clatter, a sibling would pout, and the mother would sigh, reminding everyone that complaining didn't make the food multiply. Still, those squabbles were part of the ritual, as normal as the frost creeping on the windows. And when the bowls were finally scraped clean, supper gave way to cleanup. Another round of hauling, scrubbing, stacking, and stoking the fire. No dishwashers here, just frozen fingers plunged into tepid, greasy water. Yet somehow, through all the smoke, steam, and grumbling, there was a sense of satisfaction. Supper meant you had made it one more day. To us, it might sound bleak: turnip stew, stale bread, and cabbage perfume. But to Victorians, it was comfort. A hot meal, however humble, meant survival. It meant warmth shared not just from the fire, but from family, laughter, and the stubborn joy of being alive. Let's step into a Victorian night. Dinner is over, the fire has burned low, and the house is sinking into that long, frozen silence where every sound is sharper, every draft more personal. Night wasn't a time of rest so much as a test, because surviving the coldest hours between midnight and dawn was its own kind of battle. The bedrooms were colder than the street outside. Imagine climbing the narrow staircase, each step creaking, your candle flickering in the draft, while you're already shivering from the chill that seems to seep straight through the walls. The hallway smelled faintly of damp wool, coal smoke, and cabbage stew that never quite left. By the time you reached your room, your breath was visible in the air, little puffs of white that made you feel like you were sleeping in a meat locker. The bed itself was no sanctuary. A wooden frame groaning at every move, a lumpy mattress stuffed with horsehair or straw, and a mountain of blankets heavy enough to crush you, yet never quite warm enough to keep out the icy drafts. Crawling in was like diving into a cave of scratchy fabric, every fold stiff from moisture. Sometimes you'd press your toes against a hot brick or a metal water bottle, only to find it had already gone lukewarm, leaving you with the sensation of dipping your feet into a puddle. And then came the sounds of the night. Houses talked in winter. Roof timbers cracked, windows rattled, pipes groaned. A gust of wind could make the whole place shiver, sending curtains swaying and candle flames sputtering. Outside, the street was nearly silent. No traffic, no hum of electricity. Just the lonely crunch of boots on ice if some poor soul dared to pass, or the distant call of a night watchman making his rounds. Inside, families huddled. Siblings jammed together under the same covers, stealing heat from each other, while parents whispered prayers that the fire downstairs wouldn't die before morning. Privacy didn't exist. You fell asleep elbow to elbow, tangled in blankets, with someone's cold feet inevitably pressed against your shins. The dog curled at the foot of the bed, the cat nestled near the stove if it was still warm, and the youngest child tucked deep in the middle like a hidden ember of warmth. Dreams in winter were strange. People often wrote about them, visions of summer fields, of warmth, of rivers unfrozen and air that didn't bite. Others dreamed of darker things, of frost creeping into their bones, of windows sealed with ice so thick you couldn't break free. Sleep was shallow, restless, interrupted by coughs echoing through the house. Illness stalked the night, and the sound of someone wheezing in the next bed could send shivers down your spine that had nothing to do with drafts. Every so often, someone would wake to check the fire. Padding downstairs in layers of shawls, carrying a candle, they'd stir the embers with a poker, praying for a glow. Sometimes it worked, sometimes not, and then you had no choice but to pile on more blankets, stuff rags into door cracks, and hope your body heat lasted till dawn. But for all its hardship, there was a kind of intimacy in those nights. Families whispered stories, sang quiet hymns, or told folk tales to distract the children from the cold. The glow of a single candle could transform a freezing room into a little island of comfort. You might even laugh, muffled under the covers, as someone muttered about Jack Frost scratching at the window again. And when morning finally came, when light crept back through frost-glazed windows, and you could hear the faint stirrings of neighbors braving the cold, you felt like you'd won something. Not warmth exactly, but survival. Another night down, another morning to begin again. So let's imagine the moment when the first pale light of a Victorian winter morning slips through the frost-covered windows. You've survived the night, barely, but now comes another battle. The morning ritual of facing a house that feels more like an icebox than a home. The first thing you notice when your eyes open is your own breath, hanging in the air like smoke from a tiny chimney. The glass beside your bed is opaque with frost, etched into delicate lace by Jack Frost's invisible hand. For a second it looks beautiful, but then you shift under the mountain of stiff blankets and the reality hits. Getting up means leaving the only pocket of warmth you have. The floorboards are merciless. You slide one foot out of bed, then jerk it back instantly as if you've stepped onto bare ice. Socks, if you remembered to keep a pair tucked under the blanket, are cold and stiff. If you forgot, You hop from rug to rug, searching for a path that won't numb your toes in 3 seconds flat. The bed is behind you now, sighing with the weight of quilts and family members still tangled together like reluctant sardines. From downstairs comes the sound of metal clattering, your father already at war with the coal scuttle, muttering curses under his breath. It's the same every morning, this ancient ritual of coaxing life back into the hearth. If the embers survive the night, there's hope. If not, the day begins with a smoky struggle of kindling, damp coal, and lungs full of sulfur. Children hold their breath as they pass through the kitchen, praying the fire catches before their porridge turns to stone. Breakfast is never about pleasure. It's survival fuel, porridge that could be mistaken for wallpaper paste, bread so dense it could anchor a ship, butter carved from a frozen slab with more effort than dignity. On rare days there's a treat, jam, an egg, maybe even leftover meat. But most mornings it's just bowls of gray mush, a teapot that wheezes like an old man, and the quiet competition for who gets the closest seat to the range. Meanwhile, mothers shout orders about stockings and scarves, warning children not to forget their gloves, even if the gloves are mismatched, frayed, or in fact just socks repurposed for hands. Little ones shuffle in layers until they look like overstuffed laundry bags, while older siblings complain about lost muffs and stolen shawls. Everyone argues, but the truth is, no one dares step outside until the fire has offered at least a hint of warmth. When at last the door opens, the morning air barges in like an uninvited guest. It stings the lungs, reddens the cheeks, and sends everyone scurrying for scarves to pull tighter. Boots, stiff from yesterday's snow, creak on the icy ground. The world outside is muffled in white silence. Chimneys coughing smoke into the gray sky, horses' hooves crunching, neighbors hurrying with baskets clutched to their chests. And yet, in the middle of all this discomfort, there's something quietly remarkable. Families gather, shoulder to shoulder, around a temperamental fire, sharing food, sharing complaints, and most of all sharing the stubborn will to keep going. Every clink of spoon in porridge, every puff of breath in the frozen kitchen is a reminder. They made it through the night. Now they'll make it through the day. You've just managed to swallow a bowl of lukewarm porridge, your fingers still half numb from feeding the fire and scraping frost off the water jug. Now comes the real ordeal, stepping outside. Leaving the safety of the house isn't a simple matter of opening the door. It's an expedition. Every family member layers up like they're preparing for an Arctic voyage. Scarves wrap around necks until breathing feels optional. Shawls are doubled, sometimes tripled, transforming figures into wool-wrapped bundles. Boots creak as though protesting their fate, already damp from yesterday's snow. Hats are pulled so low they double as blindfolds, and mittens are stuffed with bits of newspaper for insulation. By the time you're ready, you barely resemble yourself, more cabbage than human. The door swings open, and the first blast of morning air is like a slap across the face. It doesn't matter how many layers you're wearing, the cold finds the gaps. Your ears sting, your nose instantly runs, and your breath pours out in white clouds. The cobblestone street crunches beneath your feet, coated in a treacherous mix of ice and slush. Every step is a gamble. Will your boot hold, or will water seep through, soaking your socks for the rest of the day? For children trudging to school, the walk is less a commute and more a survival march. They huddle together, hands buried deep in mufflers or pockets, books clutched tight against the wind. The older ones tease, the younger ones whimper, and all of them secretly hope the schoolroom fire has been lit early. Teachers often demand punctuality, but icy streets and half-frozen boots make every journey late and miserable. Adults fare no better. Shopkeepers wrestle crates through snowdrifts. Factory workers shuffle along in groups, stamping their feet to keep circulation flowing. Gentlemen pull their collars high, ladies clutch skirts above the muck, and everyone walks with the stiff, penguin-like gait of people terrified of slipping. The wealthier ride in carriages, but don't envy them too quickly. The carriages are draughty, their horsehair seats as icy as the outdoors, and every gust of wind whistles through cracks in the wood. You pay for the privilege of shivering while sitting down. And then there's the marketplace. Stalls line the street, half buried in snow, their vendors stamping their feet beside tiny braziers that never seem to produce enough heat. Vegetables are stiff, fish are half frozen, and bread loaves clink when tapped, hard as bricks. Customers haggle not just for price but for speed. No one wants to linger in the cold longer than necessary. Every coin exchanged is stiff from frozen fingers, every conversation punctuated with coughs and sneezes. But for all the hardship, the streets are alive. Steam rises from horses, mingling with chimney smoke. The air carries the scent of coal fires, roasted chestnuts from street vendors, and the faint sharpness of frost itself. Children laugh when someone slips unless it's them. Neighbors exchange quick nods, their faces red and raw from the wind, bound together by the shared misery of winter survival. When you finally return home, boots leaving wet trails on the floor, cheeks stinging, you feel a strange sense of victory. You've braved the outdoors, faced the cold head-on, and made it back alive. For Victorians, that was no small accomplishment. Each errand completed, each walk survived, was one more reminder that they could endure the season's cruelty. And tomorrow, they'd do it all again. After a day of frozen errands, stiff boots, and endless shivers, evening in a Victorian household feels almost like a reward. The lamps are lit, the fire, if coaxed into life, glows faintly in the grate, and the whole family gathers in the one room where survival feels just a little less impossible. Picture it. The parlor flickers with firelight, shadows dancing across faded wallpaper. Chairs are dragged close, boots steaming as they dry, and children sprawl on the rug like cats, soaking up whatever warmth drifts outward. Mother knits, her needles clicking softly. Father pretends to read the paper, though everyone knows he's just waiting for someone else to poke the fire. The dog lies belly up in front of the hearth, smug as royalty. Entertainment isn't glamorous, but it's lively. Card games spread across the table, charades played in dim candlelight, or the family piano pressed into reluctant service for sing-alongs. Sometimes someone tells ghost stories, their voices low and dramatic, while frost creeps silently up the windows behind them. Children listen wide-eyed, half terrified, half grateful for an excuse to huddle closer together. Food, if it's there, is simple. A pot of stew bubbles weakly on the stove, mostly root vegetables with a scrap of meat if fortune has smiled. Tea is poured with reverence, every drop a small luxury. If someone has managed to secure sugar or jam, the evening takes on a celebratory air. It isn't about flavor, it's about comfort, about filling bellies and spirits before the long night ahead. As the hours slip by, talk drifts to stories of the day. How the coal fire nearly died again, how the cat stole the warmest chair, how young William managed to fall into a snowdrift on the way back from school. Everyone laughs because laughter is one of the few things winter can't freeze. Eventually, though, bedtime looms. Children are bundled into flannel nightshirts, handed a hot brick or, if they are lucky, a real hot water bottle. The upstairs rooms wait, silent and frosty. Blankets are piled high, siblings squeeze together, and the night becomes another test of endurance. Drafts sneak under doors, frost paints new patterns on the window, and somewhere in the house the fire sputters, threatening to go out. But for a little while in that warm parlor, life feels manageable. The Victorians knew winter was merciless. They knew every cough could turn dangerous, every fire could die, every coal bucket could run empty. And yet they carried on, layering up, laughing through the misery, writing long letters of complaint that doubled as proof of survival. So as you lie in your own warm bed tonight, maybe whisper a small thank you. You'll never have to huddle around a fading coal fire, chase drafts with rags, or tuck a potato into your socks just to feel your toes. You'll never have to wake up to ice on the inside of your window or debate whether to smash the chamber pot before using it. The Victorians endured all of that, and somehow they kept their humor alive. That's survival, not just of the body, but of the spirit. So good night, sleep warm, and remember, history may be cold, but it also teaches us just how resilient people can be.